My boss thought he was a genius when he stripped my name off a $500 million real estate deal to claim a seven-figure bonus for himself. He smiled as I packed my desk, thinking he had finally buried his biggest problem. What he did not realize was that by putting his signature on those altered environmental reports, he had just confessed to federal bank fraud. I did not just quit, I lit the match. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Boss Revenge Stories. I want to sincerely thank all of you for tuning in today, but I also have to share that YouTube recently demonetized our channel, leaving us without the budget to keep operating. If you enjoyed today's story, please consider supporting us by joining our Patreon channel to listen to even more incredible, exclusive true stories featuring multiple emotional voice actors that we just cannot share publicly on YouTube. You can join by scanning the QR code of the Patreon page on your screen right now, or by clicking the Patreon link in the description or pinned comment of this video. Now, let us dive into today's story, and my name is Hadley Harper. Working at Vanguard Horizon Estates in Chicago felt like breathing inside a vacuum-sealed plastic bag. On paper, it was a dream job. I was a commercial real estate acquisition analyst, perched high above the city skyline in a glass tower that looked down on everyone else. My daily existence revolved around diving deep into the microscopic details of multi-million-dollar property deals. My specialty was risk assessment and environmental, social, and governance compliance. If there was a toxic chemical leak buried under a potential development site or a murky zoning law about to change, I found it. My reports were bulletproof, meticulous, and entirely unappreciated by the man who sat in the expansive corner office. Julian Vance was our regional director. He was the kind of guy who was born on third base and spent his entire adult life congratulating himself for hitting a triple. Julian wore tailored bespoke suits that cost more than my entire first year of college tuition, and he had a polished smile that never quite reached his cold, calculating eyes. To him, I was not a human being. I was a meat firewall. I was the highly convenient barrier he used to shield himself from the inevitable fallout of his predatory pricing tactics and reckless negotiations. When a deal succeeded and brought in massive revenue, it was entirely due to Julian's visionary leadership. When a deal faced legitimate regulatory hurdles, it was suddenly my overly cautious analysis bogging things down. For 2 whole years, I absorbed the shockwaves of his aggressive, borderline unethical business practices. I swallowed my pride, telling myself it was just the price of paying my dues in corporate America. The absolute breaking point did not come with a dramatic screaming match or a thrown coffee cup. It arrived quietly on a Tuesday afternoon during a high-stakes conference call with a group of heavy-hitting investors from New York. We were finalizing the funding for a massive lakefront complex, a flagship project valued at a staggering $300 million. The investors were getting incredibly restless. There were severe delays, primarily because the soil samples had come back looking like a toxic soup, and the foundation required extensive, expensive environmental remediation before anyone could even think about pouring concrete. Julian knew all of this. I had explicitly briefed him on these exact dangers on 3 separate occasions over the past 1 month. But as the lead investor loudly demanded to know why the groundbreaking was delayed by another 6 months, Julian did not hesitate to save his own skin. His voice was incredibly smooth, dripping with feigned frustration and corporate empathy. "I completely understand your concerns, gentlemen," Julian said, leaning back in his expensive leather chair and staring out his window. "Frankly, we are just as eager to get shovels in the ground. Unfortunately, our analyst, Hadley, has been slowing progress with her rather cumbersome environmental reports. She tends to get unnecessarily bogged down in the minutiae, but I am personally stepping in to streamline her process and get this timeline back on track." The air in my lungs just vanished. I sat frozen at my desk, listening through the headset as 5 different senior executives muttered their annoyed agreements and questioned my competence. Julian was not just throwing me under the bus, he was backing it up and parking it squarely on my chest. If this massive deal went south, or if the federal environmental agencies came knocking with fines, The paper trail he was meticulously crafting in front of these powerful witnesses would point directly to my desk. He was actively preparing to turn me into his personal legal scapegoat to cover up his own gross negligence. In the past, I might have immediately unmuted my microphone and stammered out a desperate defense. I might have run to the restroom and cried out of sheer, overwhelming frustration. But sitting there in the dim light of my cubicle, looking at my own pale reflection in the darkened bezel of my computer monitor, something inside my brain simply snapped. The suffocating pressure of the Vanguard Horizon office did not crush me. Instead, it crystallized my resolve. The burning anger I had felt for 2 years instantly cooled into an absolute, razor-sharp, calculating clarity. I reached out and firmly clicked the mute button on my microphone, ensuring my silence was absolute. I looked through the glass walls of his office and watched Julian laughing and charming the investors, entirely unaware that he had just signed his own corporate death warrant. The very next morning, I arrived at the office 2 hours before the security guards even unlocked the main lobby. I opened my personal computer and partitioned a hidden, heavily encrypted hard drive. I gave it a fitting name, Project Icarus. For the next several weeks, I did not just do my assigned job. I became a digital ghost haunting Julian's every move. I began systematically backing up every single piece of raw metadata that flowed through our internal servers. I dug through the secure archives and salvaged the original, unaltered emails that Julian had secretly modified before forwarding them to the executive board. I compiled dozens of risk assessment reports that he had intentionally ignored, buried, or blatantly manipulated in order to force hesitant clients into signing binding contracts. Julian Vance truly thought I was just a blind obedient meat firewall, but he completely forgot one crucial detail about firewalls. They are specifically designed to keep a permanent log of every single malicious threat that tries to pass through them, and my logs were getting ready to burn his entire fraudulent empire straight to the ground. The architecture of deceit is not built overnight. It is constructed brick by brick, lie by lie, in the quiet, hidden spaces between keystrokes. Armed with my encrypted drive, I spent the next 3 weeks operating like a forensic pathologist examining a terminally ill patient. I pulled the raw data on every single record-breaking transaction Julian had closed over the past 18 months. I laid the historical timelines out on my secondary monitor, meticulously matching my original draft submissions against the final, polished documents logged in the company's secure external portal. What I found staring back at me was not just the typical corporate greed or a lazy boss taking credit for a subordinate's hard work. It was a perfectly orchestrated, mathematically precise symphony of federal bank fraud. I isolated the metadata and began to dissect the anatomy of his crimes. I looked at a $50 million industrial park acquisition from last November. In my original file, I had heavily flagged a severe wetland encroachment issue, explicitly noting that the Federal Environmental Protection Agency would undoubtedly require an extensive buffer zone that would effectively kill 20% of the buildable acreage. It was a massive financial liability, an absolute deal-breaker for any sane investor. But when I opened the exact same file that Julian had personally forwarded to the board of directors and the commercial lending syndicate, my intricate risk charts were completely gone. The warning paragraphs had been surgically excised from the document. The word wetlands had been casually replaced with the phrase scenic water feature. He had done the exact same thing on a massive logistics center project out in the western suburbs just 4 months ago. My geotechnical engineering summary had highlighted an extreme risk of soil subsidence, warning that the ground could literally swallow the loading docks within 5 years if expensive structural reinforcements were not immediately installed. Julian had actively deleted the entire subsidence warning matrix. He wiped the safety data clean. He had presented flawless, frictionless portfolios to the banking executives in order to secure commercial loans totaling hundreds of millions of dollars. He was building his entire kingdom on a foundation of rotting wood, sinking mud, and federal lies, and he was using my forged signature as the ultimate stamp of approval to pass the rigorous regulatory inspections. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. I was no longer just an angry, overworked employee. I was the sole, silent custodian of a nuclear secret. That Friday evening, Vanguard Horizon Estates hosted a lavish company dinner at a high-end steakhouse downtown to celebrate the close of the third quarter. The dimly lit room smelled heavily of charred prime rib, expensive truffle oil, and the sharp, arrogant tang of aged scotch. I sat quietly at the far end of the long mahogany table, nursing a single glass of sparkling water, watching the scene unfold through the cold lens of my new reality. Julian was holding court at the absolute center of the table, his face slightly flushed from the alcohol, his bespoke suit jacket casually unbuttoned. He raised his heavy crystal glass to toast his own sheer brilliance. "People look at the real estate market and they see obstacles," Julian proclaimed, his voice booming over the ambient noise of the crowded restaurant. "They see strict regulations. They see endless red tape. But vision is what separates the everyday workers from the true architects. You have to know exactly how to maneuver the narrative. That unique vision is exactly why this company is currently looking at our most profitable year in a decade." He leaned in close to one of the junior vice presidents, but his voice remained loud enough for half the room to hear. "And let me tell you, when those end-of-year bonuses hit the accounts next month, my personal accountant is going to have a genuine heart attack. We are talking 7 figures, easily. You build the vision, you reap the massive rewards." The sycophants around him chuckled loudly and clapped, raising their glasses in an enthusiastic toast to a man who was essentially bragging about his upcoming payout for committing massive federal crimes. I sat perfectly still, maintaining a pleasant, empty expression. I did not glare at him. I did not roll my eyes. I just smiled, a thin, polite line across my face, and took another slow sip of my sparkling water. I let him enjoy his expensive steak and his delusions of grandeur. I knew exactly what his last meal at this company was going to look like, and I was going to be the one serving it. While Julian was busy suffocating on his own arrogance, I was carefully laying the groundwork for my permanent extraction. The very next morning, on a crisp Saturday, I walked into a quiet, upscale coffee shop on the complete opposite side of the city. Waiting for me in a secluded corner booth was a senior executive recruiter from Apex Sterling. Apex was our fiercest competitor, the absolute arch-rival of Vanguard Horizon. If Vanguard was a blunt, reckless instrument, Apex was a precise, calculating scalpel. I sat down across from the recruiter. He looked at my empty hands, clearly expecting me to slide a standard resume across the table, detailing my formal education and my years of loyal corporate servitude. Instead, I pulled out a single, unmarked manila folder and pushed it directly toward his coffee cup. I did not bring a resume. I brought a meticulously curated profit and loss summary. Inside that folder was a sanitized, highly detailed financial projection representing the absolute cleanest, most profitable clients in my personal portfolio. These were the institutional investors and cautious developers who bypassed Julian entirely and called my direct line when they needed the real, unvarnished truth about a commercial property. They were the ones who trusted my rigorous, uncompromising data. Most importantly, they were the clients who remained completely untainted by Julian's fraudulent pet projects. The recruiter opened the folder, scanned the bottom line numbers, and his eyes visibly widened. The ambient noise of the coffee shop seemed to fade away as he slowly traced his finger down the columns of verified, highly lucrative revenue streams. He looked up at me, the predatory interest unmistakable in his gaze. He knew exactly what he was looking at. He was not just looking at a competent analyst. He was looking at a golden goose ready to lay millions of dollars directly into his firm's lap. Over the following 2 weeks, I began the quiet, clinical process of categorizing every single contact in my sprawling database. I was effectively playing God with a corporate spreadsheet. I divided them into 2 very distinct columns, cleanly separating the wheat from the toxic chaff. The first column was the lifeboat. These were the ethical, fiercely loyal clients I was going to save. These were the people who valued absolute integrity over a quick, dirty payout. I would bring them with me to the absolute safety of Apex Sterling. ensuring their hard-earned investments remained secure and their immense trust in me remained unbroken. The second column was the collateral damage. These were the aggressive, endlessly greedy clients who had happily turned a blind eye to Julian's incredibly shady tactics, just so long as their personal profit margins stayed artificially high. They were the ones who actively enabled him, who cheered on his reckless behavior, who loudly celebrated his so-called vision. I looked at their names blinking on my computer screen, felt absolutely zero pity in my chest, and assigned them to remain exactly where they were. I was going to leave them locked securely inside Julian's collapsing house of garbage, completely and utterly at the mercy of the federal banking auditors when the rotting roof inevitably caved in. Silence is a predator's least favorite sound. When you are being hunted in a corporate jungle, your panic is the oxygen that keeps your abuser's ego alive. When I stopped arguing, stopped defending my work, and started blending into the gray fabric of my cubicle, Julian noticed. My sudden quietness made his instincts twitch. He could not stand the thought that I might be growing numb to his control. So, he decided it was time to put me down for good, legally and systematically, right before the lucrative holiday bonus season. It started on a gloomy Thursday morning. I was summoned to a windowless conference room where Julian sat alongside a completely silent human resources representative. Slid across the polished table was a crisp, brutally formal document. It was a performance improvement plan, universally known in the corporate world as a PIP. Everyone knows a PIP is not actually designed to improve your performance. It is a slow, documented execution. It is a paper trail created to justify firing you without paying severance, while conveniently allowing your manager to absorb your entire year-end bonus and your coveted client list. Julian leaned forward, interlocking his fingers, wearing a mask of deep, manufactured concern. Hadley, we value your presence here, but your recent reports have been overly convoluted. You are bottlenecking our closing timelines. This plan is just a tool to help you get back on track. I am going to need to review and approve every single piece of data you generate for the next 60 days. This was the moment he expected me to fight back. He wanted me to argue, to refuse to sign, to storm out so he could terminate me for insubordination on the spot. Instead, I gave him exactly what his massive, fragile ego craved. I shrank into my chair. I let my shoulders slump. I forced my eyes to well up with genuine-looking tears, biting my lower lip as if I were desperately trying to hold myself together. I understand, Julian, I whispered, letting my voice tremble just enough to sound pathetic. I have just been so overwhelmed lately. I want to do better. I will follow your lead completely. The look of supreme satisfaction that washed over his face was absolutely sickening. He had broken me, or so he thought. Over the next 3 weeks, I played the role of the broken, incompetent subordinate flawlessly. I asked him mundane, idiotic questions. I copied him on useless administrative emails, just to show how dependent I was on his guidance. I fed his God complex a steady diet of absolute submission, inflating his arrogance until it completely blinded him to the reality of his surroundings. Then came the crown jewel of Quarter 4. The project was called Cobalt Tower. It was a proposed $500 million commercial skyscraper designed to sit right in the heart of the financial district. It was the kind of massive, legacy-defining deal that guaranteed magazine covers and seven-figure commissions. Julian was practically salivating over it. He needed this deal to close smoothly to secure his promotion to the National Executive Board. But the Cobalt Tower had a dark, rotting secret hidden deep underground. And as the lead compliance analyst, I was the first one to find it. The geological surveys were a complete disaster. The bedrock beneath the proposed site was fractured, and the historical records indicated a massive, unmapped pocket of toxic industrial runoff buried directly in the path of the foundation pylons. Building a 50-story glass tower on that site without a massive, multi-million-dollar environmental cleanup was practically a guarantee of structural failure and federal environmental lawsuits. If I wrote a standard, Plain English summary stating that the project was a toxic death trap. Julian would simply delete the paragraph like he always did. So, I changed my strategy. I did not hide the risks. I camouflaged them. I drafted a highly dense, 90-page risk assessment report. I buried the fatal warnings under layers of impenetrable, graduate-level engineering jargon. Instead of writing that the ground was poisoned and unstable, I wrote extensive, mind-numbing paragraphs about subterranean hydrostatic pressure variances and the long-term molecular degradation of load-bearing concrete due to unquantified chemical soil anomalies. I made the report so incredibly boring, so exhaustingly technical, that reading it felt like chewing on dry sand. I walked into his office late on a Tuesday afternoon, carrying the massive printed draft. I sighed heavily, rubbing my temples, looking thoroughly defeated. Julian, I tried to synthesize the structural geophysics parameters for Cobalt Tower, but I'm just struggling to streamline it. It is 90 pages long. I know the credit committee needs this by tomorrow morning to approve the $500 million loan. I am sorry. I just cannot seem to simplify the data. Julian snatched the thick binder out of my hands, rolling his eyes with a heavy, theatrical sigh. This is exactly what the PIP is about. Hadley, you are overthinking everything. The banking committee does not want to read a science dissertation. They want to see green lights and profit margins. Go home. I will clean up your mess and submit the final version myself tonight. Thank you, Julian, I said softly. Turning around and walking out of his office, the moment my back turned to him, the pathetic, helpless expression vanished from my face, replaced by a cold, predatory smile. He had taken the bait perfectly. Julian was incredibly lazy. I knew for an absolute fact he was not going to spend 5 hours reading my complex geological analysis. He was going to skim the executive summary, find the complex paragraphs that looked like potential roadblocks, delete them entirely, and replace them with vague, glowing corporate buzzwords. He would then remove my name from the title page so he could take full credit for saving the deal, just as he had done dozens of times before. But this time, I had prepared the battlefield in advance. 2 days prior, I had accessed the back end of our department's network structure. Using my administrative privileges, I wrote a hidden, automated routing script and attached it directly to the master file of the Cobalt Tower report. At 8 o'clock that night, while I was sitting on my living room couch drinking a glass of wine, my laptop pinged. Julian had opened the file on his office computer. Through my secure remote access, I watched his cursor move in real time, just as I predicted. He highlighted massive chunks of my highly technical warnings and hit the backspace key. He deleted the toxic runoff data. He erased the structural instability matrix. He stripped my name off the header, typed his own name in bold letters, and confidently changed the overall risk assessment grade from severe to minimal. Then, he clicked the digital signature button, certifying under federal law that the information within the document was accurate and truthful to the best of his knowledge. Finally, he hit the send button, routing the fraudulent document directly to the external banking syndicate. But he did not know about my hidden script. The very millisecond Julian pressed send, my code executed silently in the background. It instantly captured the delta, the exact, keystroke by keystroke difference between my original, accurate draft and his dangerously altered final version. It bundled the two files together, wrapping them in a cryptographic hash complete with an unalterable timestamp and his specific IP address login credentials. Instead of just letting the file go to the banks, my script silently duplicated the entire package and routed a blind copy straight into the secure, heavily monitored internal inbox of the Vanguard Horizon Independent Auditing Division. This was the one department completely outside of Julian's influence, a team of ruthless compliance officers whose sole job was to hunt down internal fraud. The trap had snapped shut with a deafening digital click. Julian thought he was an untouchable genius securing his $1 million bonus. He had absolutely no idea that he had just personally signed a full, legally binding confession to a massive $500 million federal bank fraud. He had locked himself in a cage, and I had just thrown the only key into the ocean. The transition from prey to predator is not marked by a loud roar. It is marked by absolute, terrifying silence. With the Cobalt Tower trap fully armed and ticking quietly in the background, my final days at Vanguard Horizon Estates were an exercise in perfect, chilling serenity. I no longer felt the suffocating weight of the office. I was just a ghost walking through the halls, making my final arrangements before the haunting came to an end. On a crisp Wednesday morning, during what was supposed to be a routine off-site coffee break, I sat in a highly secure boardroom at Apex Sterling. I held a heavy gold-plated fountain pen and signed my name on a flawless, incredibly lucrative contract. My new title was Vice President of Acquisitions. The sign-on bonus alone was massive, easily enough to pay off my entire mortgage in a single afternoon. The only condition attached to this golden parachute was explicitly clear. I had to successfully migrate 5 core clients from my Vanguard portfolio over to Apex. I smiled as I capped the pen. Those 5 clients had already been carefully selected, quietly prepped, and were simply waiting for my signal to jump ship. Back at my cramped cubicle, I began drafting my final masterpiece. I called it the client handover file. On the surface, it looked like the meticulous, overly detailed work of a highly compliant subordinate trying to ensure a smooth transition. I spent hours color-coding the document. The pages were beautifully organized, crisp, and deceptively helpful. But this document was not a map to help Julian navigate my absence. It was a brightly lit runway pointing directly toward his financial crimes. I wrote incredibly specific client care notes that were, in reality, carefully disguised audits. Under one client profile, I added a brightly highlighted note reminding the next analyst to double-check the auxiliary vendor fees, casually mentioning a series of bizarre, undocumented cost overruns I had noticed in Julian's third-quarter billing cycles. Under another, I advised strict adherence to escrow protocols, pointing out glaring inconsistencies in how Julian had managed their holding accounts. To an untrained eye, it looked like I was just being thorough. To a forensic accountant, it looked like a treasure map leading straight to Julian's hidden embezzlement schemes. I printed the document, bound it in a sleek black folder, and slipped it into a heavy manila envelope. I did not write Julian's name on it. Friday arrived, bringing with it the lazy, checked-out energy that always infected the office right before the weekend. I waited until the exact right moment, at exactly 4:59 in the afternoon, while Julian was undoubtedly pouring himself a celebratory glass of scotch in his corner office. I opened a pre-written draft and pressed send on my resignation email. It was short, immaculately polite, and legally bulletproof. I formally submitted my required 2 weeks of notice, knowing full well I would not be doing a single ounce of real work during that time. I thanked him for the opportunity to grow. I offered 0 complaints, 0 emotion, and absolutely 0 room for negotiation. I closed my laptop and stood up. I did not need packing boxes. I took exactly 15 minutes to pack up my life. I slid my favorite pens, my customized mechanical keyboard, and a framed photo of my dog into a leather tote bag. I purposely left behind the cheap, acrylic Employee Appreciation Awards Vanguard had given me over the years. They looked exactly like what they were, worthless pieces of plastic meant to buy silence. I slung my bag over my shoulder and walked past Julian's closed office door without a single sideways glance, but I did not head for the elevator bank that led to the parking garage. Instead, I took the executive stairwell up to the top floor. The C-suite was already empty for the weekend, wrapped in heavy mahogany and silence. I walked straight past the vacant reception desk and stopped in front of the massive double doors belonging to the chief risk officer. He was the most feared man in the entire corporation, a ruthless former federal prosecutor whose only job was to protect the company from massive legal liabilities. I reached into my tote bag, pulled out the sealed manila envelope containing the client handover file, and slid it gently onto the exact center of his pristine, uncluttered desk. I turned around, walked out of the building, and stepped into the cool Chicago evening air. The storm was coming, but I would be watching it from a very safe distance. Monday morning arrived with the bright, arrogant sunshine that Julian Vance always felt he was rightfully owed. I was not there to witness it personally, but the chaotic play-by-play was relayed to me by a trusted former colleague who was quietly watching the absolute wreckage unfold. Julian strolled into the office holding his expensive artisan latte, opened his inbox, and saw my perfectly polite resignation email. He actually laughed out loud in the middle of the bullpen. To him, my departure was not a catastrophic loss. It was a total, unmitigated victory. He genuinely believed his manipulative performance improvement plan had successfully broken a weak link. More importantly, he assumed he was now the sole, uncontested inheritor of my entire highly lucrative client portfolio. He practically danced his way to the break room, boasting loudly to the junior associates that he was finally trimming the dead weight from his department and streamlining for maximum profit. He had absolutely no idea that 10 floors above his head, the corporate weather was rapidly, violently changing. The chief risk officer arrived at his desk precisely at 8 o'clock in the morning. He was a man who lived and breathed disastrous scenarios, and he did not waste time. He poured a black coffee, sat down, and opened the sealed manila envelope I had left squarely on his desk on Friday afternoon. He began reading the client handover file with a clinical, entirely detached eye, but as he flipped to the third page, his highly honed, seasoned instincts flared into overdrive. He cross-referenced my subtle, brightly color-coded notes regarding missing escrow funds and bizarre, unauthorized vendor fees with the massive, newly submitted Cobalt Tower commercial loan file. The chief risk officer rarely showed any physical emotion, but as the intricate puzzle pieces of my document slammed into place, a cold, unmistakable sweat broke out on the back of his neck. He immediately picked up his secure red phone, bypassed Julian completely, and dialed directly into the core of the independent auditing division. He demanded they immediately pull the internal routing logs for the Cobalt Tower submission. When the auditing team opened the hidden file that my digital script had secretly copied to their inbox on Tuesday night, the internal alarms did not just ring, they completely shattered the glass. Less than 24 hours later, the very first shockwave of the blast hit Julian's floor. My carefully orchestrated lifeboat protocol activated with absolute perfection. The 5 massive, impeccably clean institutional clients I had categorized for immediate extraction simultaneously sent formal, legally binding notices terminating their contracts with Vanguard Horizon Estates. They cited an immediate transition of their assets to Apex Sterling, effective right at that very second. Julian was sitting comfortably in a mid-morning strategy meeting when his phone began vibrating uncontrollably on the table. One by one, the automated cancellation receipts flooded his inbox. In the span of 45 minutes, a staggering 40% of his entire annual revenue completely vaporized into thin air. He rushed out of the meeting room, his face flushed a furious, panicked red, frantically dialing the private numbers of the defecting clients, only to find himself instantly routed to their respective legal departments, who firmly refused to let him speak to anyone. Before Julian could even catch his breath to fully process the massive financial hemorrhage, the real, unavoidable nightmare walked right through the glass double doors of his department. They did not wear tailored suits. They wore dark federal windbreakers, a team of stern, unsmiling investigators from the Federal Banking Commission, closely escorted by Vanguard's own internal security officers, rapidly descended upon the floor. They completely bypassed the shocked receptionist and began physically taping off Julian's corner office. They violently unplugged the server racks and placed bright yellow evidence tags on his desktop computer. They were locking down the entire department on direct suspicion of federal commercial loan fraud and severe environmental document forgery. Total, unadulterated chaos erupted in the bullpen. Analysts were loudly ordered to step away from their keyboards and leave their cell phones on their desks. Julian stood frozen in the center of the room, watching his untouchable kingdom being brutally dismantled piece by piece. Panic is a magnificent, terrifying truth serum. Cornered, desperate, and watching his career burn, Julian burst into the main executive boardroom where the chief risk officer and the senior legal team had hastily assembled to manage the crisis. His polished, arrogant veneer was completely gone. He was sweating profusely, his expensive silk tie loosened, his voice cracking with sheer hysteria as he pointed frantic, shaking fingers toward the direction of my empty desk down the hall. "This is a massive mistake," Julian shouted, slamming his open palms violently onto the heavy mahogany table. "It is Hadley, that incompetent, bitter analyst, must have made a massive typo on the Cobalt Tower risk assessment. She completely botched the environmental data before she quit, because she knew I was getting ready to fire her. I just forwarded what she gave me. You have to arrest her, not me." The frantic energy in the room instantly vanished, replaced by a dead, suffocating silence. The chief risk officer did not yell. He did not even blink. He simply reached into a thick leather folder and slid a heavy stack of printed time-stamped metadata logs across the polished wood until they rested directly under Julian's trembling hands. There were absolutely no typos. "Julian," the chief risk officer said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper that echoed in the quiet room. "We have the original, highly detailed draft she submitted to you. We also have the automated internal routing log, containing the exact timestamp and the specific IP address of the user who systematically deleted 50 pages of severe environmental warnings, replaced them with fake data, removed her name, and intentionally typed in your name before hitting send." Julian stared down at the papers, his jaw trembling uncontrollably as his own unique login credentials, his own digital fingerprints, stared back at him in bold, undeniable black ink. "You are the only person who touched those files," the chief risk officer finished, calmly signaling for the two armed security guards waiting silently by the boardroom door. "And you are the absolutely only one going down for it." The emergency board of directors meeting was convened before noon. The massive oak doors of the top-floor executive suite were securely locked from the inside. Julian Vance did not walk in with his usual arrogant stride. He was flanked by two heavily armed corporate security officers, his face completely drained of blood, looking exactly like a man marching toward a guillotine. The senior executives sitting around the expansive table did not look at him with anger. They looked at him with the cold, absolute detachment of a surgeon preparing to amputate a rotting limb. But the federal loan fraud was only the first wave of his destruction. The absolute masterstroke, the final hidden trap I had left waiting for him, was unveiled when the chief financial officer opened a secondary folder. My client handover file had done much more than just highlight his reckless environmental cover-ups. The beautifully color-coded notes I had written regarding his auxiliary vendor fees had intentionally pointed a massive, glaring spotlight at a complex network of shell companies. "We ran an immediate, deep-dive audit on the third-party vendors you authorized for the past 3 quarters, the chief financial officer stated, his voice completely devoid of any sympathy. "These companies do not exist. Julian, you created phantom contractors to falsely invoice the firm, and you have been quietly funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars in fake commission kickbacks directly into your personal offshore accounts. Your former analyst did not just document your gross negligence, she meticulously mapped out your embezzlement." Julian collapsed heavily into his chair, unable to speak, unable to even breathe. He was terminated right there on the spot. It was absolute, undeniable annihilation. He was immediately stripped of his entire equity stake in the company. His highly anticipated 7-figure holiday bonus was permanently revoked, seized to help pay the impending corporate legal fines. He was no longer a powerful regional director. He was a disgraced, utterly ruined man facing a very long stint in a federal prison cell for multiple counts of wire fraud and grand embezzlement. Just a few blocks down the street, sitting in a beautiful sunlit corner office at Apex Sterling, I slowly sipped a cup of hot black coffee. I looked out through the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows, watching the chaotic, beautiful rush of the Chicago traffic moving steadily far below me. The suffocating weight of the past 2 years was completely gone, replaced entirely by the quiet, intoxicating thrill of absolute victory. My phone suddenly vibrated on the polished mahogany desk. The screen lit up with a rapid succession of frantic text messages from an unsaved number, but I knew exactly who it was. The long blocks of text swung wildly between pathetic, desperate begging and unhinged, furious threats. I did not read them. I simply smiled, tapped the screen, and hit the block button, erasing him from my life forever. They say men in expensive Italian leather shoes always walk faster, but they forget one crucial detail. The person who draws the new map is the one who decides whether or not there are landmines hidden under the rug. Thank you all so very much for listening to my story today. I would absolutely love to know where you are tuning in from. So please let me know your city or country in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story and want to help support our channel during this time, please consider joining the Boss Revenge Stories Patreon. It is the only place where you can hear our absolute best, most exclusive true stories featuring incredible voice acting that we simply cannot publish publicly on YouTube. You can join by scanning the QR code currently on your screen or by clicking the link provided in the description and the pinned comment. Stay sharp, know your worth, and I will see you in the next one.